Charleston, South Carolina, was known for its old-world charm. The graceful, Spanish moss-covered oak trees that lined the streets and the stately mansions that dotted the historic district were the perfect setting for a wedding that could rival any fairy tale. But to Margaret Thompson, it wasn't the charm of Charleston that was at the forefront of her mind, it was the upcoming wedding of her son, Andrew, to Jessica Miller, a woman who seemed too perfect to be true. Margaret had always prided herself on her sharp instincts. She had raised Andrew as a single mother after the death of her husband, and if there was one thing she'd learned over the years, it was to trust her gut. Yet, when Jessica came into Andrew's life, Margaret pushed her reservations aside. Andrew, her only child, had finally found someone he seemed to love deeply, and Margaret couldn't bear to see him alone, especially after the loss of his father 3 years earlier. But something about Jessica rubbed Margaret the wrong way. It wasn't just her beauty, Jessica had a kind of ethereal quality, the sort that could make heads turn. It wasn't even her charm. The way she fluttered around, telling stories of her difficult upbringing and how much she longed for family, was enough to make anyone's heart ache. No, what bothered Margaret was something subtle, almost invisible. It was the inconsistencies. Jessica had claimed to have grown up in multiple cities, each with a different story about her childhood. She couldn't seem to remember details, her memories were foggy, the years hazy. And she was always so guarded about money. She would pay for everything in cash, declaring it an old-fashioned preference. It didn't make sense. But Margaret kept quiet. After all, Andrew was in love, and that meant the world to her. The wedding was coming together perfectly, or so it seemed. The Bellamy estate was the venue of choice, a historic plantation-style house with sprawling gardens that could accommodate 300 guests. The flowers were arranged in precise bouquets, flown in from Ecuador. The cake would be a towering masterpiece, and Jessica's dress, a $12,000 Vera Wang gown, fit her like a glove. It was everything a bride could dream of. And Margaret had paid for every bit of it. She was determined to make it the wedding of the century, the one Andrew and Jessica would remember for the rest of their lives. It didn't matter that Jessica's family wasn't contributing, Jessica had cried, saying her family disapproved of the marriage. Margaret opened her wallet without hesitation, wanting nothing more than to make her son happy. She even lent Jessica her grandmother's pearl necklace, a family heirloom that had been passed down through generations of Thompsons. Jessica had gasped in gratitude, eyes welling with what seemed to be real emotion. "You're like the mother I never had," she had whispered, and Margaret had smiled, trusting her. But something still didn't sit right. 6 months had passed since Jessica came into their lives, and Margaret couldn't ignore the nagging feeling any longer. As the wedding day drew closer, those doubts festered, growing stronger with each passing day. And then, it happened. The moment that would change everything. It was a normal day, one that started with Margaret dropping off a box of wedding favors at Andrew's apartment. She had decided to surprise him, wanting to see the look on his face when he saw everything coming together. But when she arrived, she didn't knock immediately. Instead, she heard voices from inside, muffled at first but growing clearer as she pressed her ear to the door. The conversation stopped when she heard a low voice, a voice that wasn't Andrew's. "Jessica." "Marcus," Jessica's voice was tight, almost frantic. "I told you not to call me on this number." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. Marcus? She'd never heard of him. The conversation continued, and Margaret, frozen in place, listened with growing horror. "No, the wedding is still on schedule." "Yes, I'll have access to his accounts after we're married." "What do you mean you want a bigger cut?" "We agreed on 30%. Look, the old lady has already given us over $40,000, and she'll probably give us more for the house down payment after the wedding. This Mark is worth at least $200,000, maybe more." "No, he doesn't suspect anything. He's completely hooked." "Mark? Her son?" Margaret felt a coldness settle in her bones as she pieced the words together. Her son had been targeted. He had been marked for exploitation by the very woman he loved. The world seemed to close in around her. Jessica wasn't who she claimed to be. She wasn't even Jessica. Margaret's legs went weak, and she nearly dropped the box of favors. She couldn't think. Her hands trembled as she quickly backed away from the door, her mind racing. This wasn't just about a woman trying to get her hands on Andrew's money. This was a woman who was about to tear apart her son's life. Margaret left the apartment as quietly as she could, retreating to her car. Her mind was spinning, a whirlwind of disbelief and rage. She drove aimlessly, needing time to think, but her hands were shaking too violently to focus on the road. She pulled over 3 blocks away and sat in the car, breathless, fighting the overwhelming wave of panic. It wasn't just that Jessica had lied to Andrew. She had been playing him for months, pulling him into a web of deception. And Margaret had played right into it, believing Jessica's stories, paying for the wedding, gifting her the family heirloom. Her heart burned with fury at the betrayal. But as Margaret sat there, a sudden shift occurred. The anger was still there, but there was something else now. A fierce determination. She wasn't going to let this woman destroy her son. Not if she could help it. No, Jessica had picked the wrong family to mess with. Margaret knew she needed proof. Real, undeniable evidence that would open Andrew's eyes and expose Jessica for what she really was. She couldn't confront Andrew with accusations, he would never believe her. But there was someone who could help her. Margaret did something she never thought she would. She Googled private investigators in Charleston. The next morning, she met with Patricia Hayes, a former police detective turned private investigator. She was a few years younger than Margaret but had an aura of confidence that put her at ease. "Mrs. Thompson," Patricia said after listening to the situation, "what you're describing sounds like a classic romance scam with a marriage twist. These people are professionals. They study their targets, learn what they want to hear, and become exactly that person." Margaret's resolve solidified. This woman, Jessica, or Sarah, had been using Andrew. And now, Margaret was going to expose her. She slid a check across the table to Patricia. "How long will it take?" Margaret asked, voice steady. Patricia smiled grimly. "Not long at all, if she's stupid enough to use her real voice on the phone." Margaret could feel the weight of the battle ahead, but for the first time in days, she felt a sense of purpose. She was going to make sure Jessica, no, Sarah, got exactly what she deserved. The days following Margaret's meeting with Patricia Hayes felt like a blur of preparation and growing anticipation. The wedding was just days away, but Margaret had no intention of sitting back and letting this woman destroy her son's life. With Patricia's help, she was about to unearth the full extent of Jessica's, no, Sarah's, deception. Margaret threw herself into the investigation with the same energy she had once used to care for Andrew as a child. Her son had always been the most important thing in her life. No matter what the cost, no matter how inconvenient or uncomfortable the process, she was determined to save him from this woman. And the first step was to find the truth. Patricia was sharp, methodical, and efficient. As soon as Margaret had given her the go-ahead, she dove into the task of tracing Sarah Collins, Jessica's real identity, through every available public record, photograph, and connection. Margaret would later come to appreciate Patricia's expertise in investigative work. The former detective knew exactly how to approach a case like this, with quiet persistence and a no-nonsense attitude. Within days, Patricia's findings were more shocking than Margaret had expected. "Mrs. Thompson," Patricia said, her voice low and serious, "I have some news that's going to be difficult to hear." Margaret sat at the small cafe table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, though she wasn't thirsty. The air around her seemed to thicken as Patricia continued. "Jessica Miller doesn't exist," Patricia's words landed like a bombshell. "The woman your son is planning to marry is actually Sarah Collins, and she has a long history of fraud. I have all the details, but you need to sit down for this. Margaret's heart clenched, and she gripped her teacup tightly, her hands trembling. This was the moment she had dreaded, the confirmation of everything her gut had told her all along. But she remained calm, listening intently as Patricia laid out the details. Sarah Collins is 29 years old, originally from Tampa. She's been arrested 3 times in the last 5 years for fraud. Only one conviction, but she's been running scams with the help of men like Marcus Rivera, who is her frequent accomplice, Patricia continued, her voice steady but laced with disdain. Margaret's mind raced. She had never heard of Sarah Collins before. But now, everything started to fall into place. The inconsistencies in Jessica's stories, her reluctance to share details about her past, the odd behaviors that seemed off but were easily explained away. It had all been a front, a carefully constructed lie to lure Andrew in, to gain his trust and manipulate him for financial gain. Patricia paused, letting the gravity of the information sink in. Margaret's blood ran cold as she processed the revelation. I've got more, Patricia added, pulling out a series of photographs from a folder. Sarah's been using the Jessica Miller identity for over 8 months. She even has a fake social security number and employment history. Her nursing job at the pediatric center? Fake. Her volunteer work at the animal shelter? Just enough to make her seem real. Margaret's mind reeled as she absorbed the new reality. This woman had been playing Andrew for months, pretending to be someone she wasn't. She had been fooling everyone, Andrew, his friends, even Margaret. And now, the truth had come crashing in. Patricia continued, Sarah's been working with Marcus for a while. They've been in and out of several scams together. And he's been trying to track her down for 2 years after she stole from him. He's been searching for her ever since she disappeared with $15,000 he'd given her to help with another con. Margaret's eyes narrowed. This was it. Marcus Rivera was the key to exposing Sarah. The man who had been scammed by Sarah would be the one who could help Margaret uncover the full extent of her son's fiancé's crimes. Where is Marcus now? Margaret asked, her voice sharp with newfound determination. Patricia's face softened with understanding. He's in Atlanta, working construction. I can get you his contact information. But Mrs. Thompson, I need to warn you, this is a dangerous game. If you want to confront Sarah, you need to be prepared for her to fight back. Margaret nodded. I'm prepared. With the investigation now in full swing, Margaret set to work. She wasn't going to let Sarah, or Jessica, as Andrew knew her, destroy her son's life. She was going to do everything in her power to expose the truth, and if that meant confronting a con artist in front of hundreds of wedding guests, so be it. The next morning, Margaret found herself sitting in her car, parked outside a coffee shop in downtown Charleston. Her heart was pounding, but she forced herself to stay calm. This was it. This was the moment she had been preparing for. She was about to call Marcus Rivera, the man who had been scammed by Sarah Collins, and ask for his help. The phone rang only once before Marcus answered. Marcus Rivera, his voice was cautious, professional. Mr. Rivera, my name is Margaret Thompson, Margaret said, her voice steady. I believe you know my son's fiancée, though you knew her as Sarah Collins, not Jessica Miller. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then, the words Margaret had been waiting for. Where is she? Marcus asked, his voice tight with urgency. Margaret leaned forward, speaking as calmly as she could. She's about to marry my son in Charleston in just 9 days. She's already stolen over $40,000 from us, and she's planning to take much more. I believe you and I can help each other. Marcus was silent for a moment, but when he spoke again, his voice was colder, harder. What are you proposing? Margaret's lips curled into a thin smile. I need you to attend the wedding. You're the key to exposing her for who she really is. I want you to confront her, right in front of everyone. Let Andrew see her for what she really is, before she destroys his life. Marcus didn't hesitate. I've been looking for Sarah for 2 years. I'll do it. When and where? Margaret's resolve hardened. The wedding's in 9 days. I'll make sure you get the details. We'll make this unforgettable. The phone call ended, and Margaret sat back in her seat, staring out at the street as the weight of the situation settled in. This was the moment. She had the proof. She had Marcus. And soon, she would have the truth. The wedding wouldn't be what anyone expected, but in the end, Margaret knew it would be exactly what Andrew needed. She wasn't just saving him from a fraudster. She was saving him from a life of lies, manipulation, and heartbreak. And Margaret Thompson was going to make sure of it. The morning of the wedding arrived, and despite the gray skies and drizzle outside, the Bellamy estate stood poised in all its antebellum splendor. The historic mansion, with its pristine white columns and sprawling gardens, had been transformed into the setting for what was supposed to be the most magical day of Andrew and Jessica's lives. But Margaret Thompson, for all the beauty surrounding her, wasn't thinking about the flowers, the music, or the guests. No, her mind was focused on something far more important. She was going to expose a fraud, and nothing, not even the heavy rain, was going to stop her from making sure her son saw the truth. By now, Margaret had put her plan into action. The Bellamy Estate's event coordinator, Mrs. Sullivan, was expecting a call from the Miller family, who had suddenly taken over all payments for the wedding, as Margaret had orchestrated. The caterers, the florist, the photographer, all had been told that the bride's family would handle the final balance. And they would be trying to reach Jessica all day, while she would be conveniently unavailable, leaving her scrambling to cover the financial mess that Margaret had carefully arranged. Margaret had already been uninvited from the wedding, but that wasn't going to stop her from attending. If Jessica thought she could remove her from the equation, she was gravely mistaken. Margaret had learned the ins and outs of the Bellamy estate, thanks to multiple visits to help with wedding planning. She knew there were back entrances, ways in that didn't involve the front door. And it was through one of those entrances that she would make her grand entrance. It was nearly 1 p.m. when Margaret arrived at the Bellamy estate. She was dressed simply but elegantly in a black dress, her grandmother's pearls around her neck, pearls that Jessica had admired so much just months ago. Margaret adjusted the pearls, letting their familiar weight settle on her chest. They were about to play a pivotal role in exposing the woman who had tried to take everything from her son. Inside, chaos had already begun to unfold. As expected, the wedding vendors had begun calling Jessica's family about the outstanding balances that Margaret had shifted onto them. The phones had been ringing non-stop, each call bringing more panic to the already stressed bride. Margaret watched the scene unfold from behind a marble column near the chapel entrance, hidden from view by the hustle and bustle. The staff was too busy dealing with payment issues to notice the small woman in a simple black dress carrying flowers. No one could have predicted the drama that was about to unfold. No one except for Margaret, who had carefully orchestrated every detail. She glanced at her watch. It was 2 p.m. The ceremony was about to begin. She could already hear the guests settling into their seats, the soft murmur of anticipation filling the air. Margaret's heart pounded in her chest as she positioned herself just inside the chapel, standing behind a pillar where she could see everything, but remain unseen. Outside, Marcus Rivera, the man who had once been Sarah Collins' partner in crime, was waiting. At 1:30 p.m., he had arrived and parked just outside the venue, following Margaret's instructions to the letter. He was a man on a mission, one that had taken him 2 years to complete. Now, he was about to confront the woman who had destroyed his life, just as she was about to destroy Andrew's. The final piece of the puzzle was in place. Margaret reached into her pocket and sent the text that would trigger the next move of her plan. The wedding march began to play, and the guests stood as Sarah Collins, still wearing the name Jessica Miller, made her grand entrance. Her $12,000 Vera Wang gown shimmered under the chandeliers as she walked down the aisle, her arms held out in front of her like a perfect bride. Margaret watched closely, noticing the slight tremor in Sarah's hands. It was the first crack in her carefully constructed persona. Andrew stood at the altar, his face glowing with happiness. He had no idea that the woman he thought he loved was about to be exposed for what she truly was. Margaret's heart ached for him, but she knew this was the only way. He had to see the truth, no matter how painful. As Sarah reached the altar, Margaret's phone buzzed in her hand. The signal had been sent. Marcus Rivera was in position. And then, just as Sarah reached the altar, Marcus made his move. "Sarah Collins," he called out, his voice ringing through the chapel like thunder. Every head in the chapel turned. Andrew's expression shifted from joy to confusion, and Margaret's breath caught in her throat as she watched the moment unfold. Sarah's face went white, her smile faltering as she glanced toward the man who had just exposed her. Marcus stepped forward, his voice growing louder as he approached the altar. "Did you really think you could hide forever?" he continued, his words sharp and accusatory. Andrew, still stunned, stepped in front of Sarah, trying to protect her. "Sir, I think you have the wrong person. This is Jessica Miller." Marcus laughed, but it wasn't a laugh of amusement. It was cold, cruel. "Jessica Miller? Is that what she's calling herself now?" With that, Marcus pulled out a manila folder from his jacket. "Her real name is Sarah Collins, and she's a professional con artist," he announced. "I should know. I was her partner until she stole $15,000 from me." The guests gasped. Some took out their phones, already recording the spectacle that was unfolding before them. Andrew turned to Sarah, confusion written all over his face. "What is he talking about?" he asked, his voice trembling. Sarah's face turned red, and for a moment, she seemed to lose her composure. Her practiced sweetness evaporated, replaced by panic. "He's lying," she said, her voice cracking. "Andrew, I don't know this man. He's clearly mentally ill." But the cracks in her mask were already showing. Marcus wasn't done. "Here's Sarah at the Ritz-Carlton in Miami, running a credit card scam on elderly tourists," he continued, holding up photos for all to see. "Here she is in Birmingham, posing as a cancer patient to steal from church collection funds. And here's my favorite, Sarah leaving our hotel room in Memphis with my wallet, my watch, and the engagement ring I was stupid enough to buy her." Andrew's face had gone pale, his eyes darting between Sarah and the photos. "Jessica, what is this?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Sarah's calm facade had shattered completely now. No, I didn't mean it that way. "I love you, Andrew," she pleaded, her voice now tinged with desperation. But Marcus wasn't done. "You want to know the real kicker," he said, stepping even closer. "She was planning to clean out your bank accounts and disappear within 6 months. That's her standard timeline. Long enough to establish legal claim to marital assets, but short enough to avoid getting too attached." Andrew's face went from disbelief to horror as the truth began to sink in. His eyes turned toward Sarah's neck, where Margaret's grandmother's pearls glistened against her skin. The same pearls that Margaret had lent to her, the ones Jessica had so eagerly accepted. Marcus held up his phone. "Want to hear the recording I made of our conversation 3 weeks ago? The one where you laugh about how easy it is to manipulate lonely old women and their devoted sons?" Andrew's hands shook as he reached for his phone. The world around him seemed to slow as he processed the words coming from the recording. "The old bat is so desperate for grandchildren, she'll believe anything," Sarah's voice echoed through the room. "And the son, complete mama's boy. All I have to do is cry about my tragic past, and he writes another check." Andrew's face twisted in disgust. "You called my mother that?" he asked, his voice barely audible. The truth was undeniable. Sarah had been playing him for a fool, and now everyone knew it. The wedding, which had once promised to be the happiest day of Andrew's life, had turned into a nightmare. But for Margaret, it was the beginning of the end for Sarah Collins, and the start of Andrew's journey toward healing. The guests watched in stunned silence as Sarah, now exposed for the fraud she was, struggled to maintain her composure. The world had just seen the woman she truly was, and there was no turning back now. The silence that followed Marcus's explosive revelation was suffocating. Every eye in the chapel was fixed on Sarah Collins, or rather, the woman who had pretended to be Jessica Miller. Andrew stood frozen, his face a portrait of shock and disbelief. The guests around him murmured in disbelief, many of them still trying to process what had just unfolded. Margaret, hidden behind her column, held her breath as she watched the chaos unravel. But Sarah wasn't finished. She scrambled to gather herself, her hands shaking as she clutched at her $12,000 Vera Wang gown. She straightened her back, forcing a fake smile, but the cracks were visible. The act was over. Her carefully constructed persona was falling apart before her eyes. You're all wrong, Sarah sputtered, her voice trembling. I'm Jessica Miller. I love Andrew. We're getting married today. Her voice shook with desperation, but no one was buying her act anymore. Not after the photos Marcus had shown, not after the damning recording that echoed through the chapel like a death knell. Andrew's eyes were wide with horror as he turned to face Sarah, his gaze lingering on the pearls around her neck, the pearls that had been passed down through 4 generations of Thompsons. The symbol of family. The symbol of love. His mother's love. And now, here they were, around the neck of a woman who had deceived them all. Andrew's voice cracked. What? What is this? Sarah's face flushed, but instead of offering an explanation, she merely stood there, too stunned to speak. Her eyes darted between the guests, the photographer, and Andrew, as if trying to find a way out, but there was no escape. The truth had come crashing down around her. Margaret stepped forward, her presence now impossible to ignore. She had been watching the scene unfold from behind the column, her eyes never leaving her son, whose face was now pale with the weight of the revelation. She knew this was the hardest moment for him, the moment when he would have to accept that the woman he had loved had never existed. Margaret's heart broke for him, but she also knew it was time for him to face the truth. She straightened her posture, walking toward the altar where Andrew and Sarah stood, the eyes of the entire room on her. The final curtain had dropped, and there was no going back now. Andrew's eyes locked with his mother's as she stepped into view. For a moment, they simply stood there, facing each other. Andrew's expression was a mixture of confusion, anger, and something that Margaret hadn't seen in years, betrayal. "Mom, what are you doing here?" he asked in a hoarse whisper, the question barely audible in the stunned silence. "You said you were going to Savannah. You lied to me." Margaret's heart clenched at the sound of his voice. She hadn't wanted to lie to him, but this was the only way. "I didn't lie, sweetheart. I had to be here. I had to make sure you saw the truth." Her voice was steady, though inside, her emotions were a storm. "This woman," she gestured toward Sarah, who was standing there in shock, "has been lying to you from the start. She's been using you, Andrew. And I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner. But now you know." Andrew's face twisted with disbelief. No. No, this can't be true." He turned to Sarah, searching her face, as though hoping she would deny it. "Jessica, please. Tell me this isn't true. Tell me you're not this person." But Sarah's mask had slipped. She could no longer maintain the illusion of innocence. "Andrew, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. She tried to take a step forward, but Andrew recoiled, as if her touch would contaminate him. I did what I had to do," she continued, her words tumbling out in a desperate attempt to salvage the wreckage of her carefully constructed life. "I was just trying to make things better, for both of us." Andrew's shoulders slumped as the weight of her words settled in. For both of us? Or for you, Sarah? For you to get everything you wanted? The guests were watching now, many of them with their phones raised, capturing the spectacle unfolding before them. This was no longer a wedding. It had turned into a public trial, with Sarah standing in the center of it, exposed for the fraud she was. Marcus stepped forward, a small, grim smile on his face. You really thought you could keep this up, didn't you, Sarah? Thought you could play Andrew for a fool while you bled him dry? You weren't just playing him, though. You were playing us all. Andrew's gaze shifted from Sarah to the man standing before him, and the realization hit him like a punch to the gut. You were part of this? You were in on it? Marcus's expression softened, though there was no warmth in it. I was, until she took me for everything I had. I trusted her, too. I thought she was someone worth believing in. But she's a scam artist, Andrew. And I came here today to make sure you didn't make the same mistake I did. Andrew's face reddened, the anger rising in him like a tidal wave. He looked back at Sarah, his eyes blazing. You lied to me. All this time, you lied to me. And I was so blind I didn't see it. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but whether they were genuine or part of her performance, Margaret couldn't tell. Andrew, please, she pleaded. I love you. I didn't mean for it to go this far. But Andrew, now fully awake to the betrayal, took a step back. You don't love me. You never did. You used me. And you used my mother. Margaret's voice was soft but firm as she spoke, stepping forward to place a hand on Andrew's shoulder. Sweetheart, you're not the only one who's been fooled. I've been there, too. But you can't let this woman destroy you. She doesn't care about you. She never did. The room was silent as Andrew processed his mother's words. He stood still for a long moment, his mind racing as the truth settled in. The woman he thought he would marry, the woman he had shared dreams with, was a lie. He had been a mark in her game, and it was only now, with his mother's help, that he was seeing the light. With a deep breath, Andrew turned to face the guests, his voice steady but filled with emotion. I can't marry a woman who's built her life on lies. I'm sorry, everyone. But this wedding is over. The room buzzed with murmurs of shock and disbelief, but Andrew stood tall. His heart was broken, but he was free. And Margaret, despite the turmoil she had caused, felt a quiet pride for the man her son was becoming. As Sarah was led away by the FBI, the reality of the situation began to settle in. She had been exposed. The truth had finally caught up with her. And Margaret? Margaret had done what she had to do. She had protected her son. But there was still work to be done. The road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in weeks, Margaret felt a glimmer of hope. The wedding may have been a disaster, but her son was safe, and that was all that mattered. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Guests filtered out of the chapel, many of them still processing what had happened. The reception that wasn't a reception turned into a much-needed break from the tension, with the guests finally relaxing, some even beginning to laugh at the absurdity of it all. Andrew and Margaret shared a quiet moment together. There would be questions, and the fallout would be far-reaching, but for now, they had each other. The bond between them was stronger than it had ever been. As they walked together, Margaret whispered, I'll always be here for you, sweetheart. No matter what happens, we'll face it together. And for the first time in a long while, Andrew smiled, a real smile, not one clouded by confusion or hurt. He was finally free, and he had his mother to thank for that. The aftermath of the wedding scandal rippled through Charleston, and for Andrew, the true weight of the day had yet to fully hit. As the FBI led Sarah away, the entire chapel was abuzz with whispered conversations and the flashing of phone cameras. The arrest of a bride, in her wedding gown, was something no one could ever forget. The groom, his face pale and strained, stood silently beside his mother as the room slowly emptied, leaving them alone with their thoughts. Andrew stood there, his mind swirling in a vortex of emotions, anger, confusion, betrayal. But most of all, there was the lingering ache of regret. He had fallen so deeply for Sarah, trusting her with everything he had. And yet, the woman he had thought he knew was nothing but a well-rehearsed lie. Margaret, who had always been a strong, stoic presence in his life, stepped forward and placed a gentle hand on his arm. She didn't speak right away. There was no need. Andrew was lost in his own thoughts, but he could feel the weight of her understanding, her strength. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Andrew turned to her, his eyes filled with pain. "I don't know how I didn't see it, Mom. How could I have been so blind?" Margaret's heart broke for her son. She had seen him grow from a bright, loving child into a strong, independent man, and she knew this was a moment he would carry with him forever. "Sweetheart, you weren't blind. You were in love. And sometimes, when you're in love, you don't see the things that are right in front of you. You trusted her. That's not something you should regret. But I should have listened to you. You warned me. You always warned me." Margaret smiled sadly, her eyes soft with affection. "I only wanted what was best for you. I always have. But you have to remember this, what happened today isn't your fault. You were targeted by someone who knows exactly how to manipulate people, how to make them feel loved, wanted, and needed. She saw your vulnerability, and she used it to her advantage. But you didn't cause this, Andrew. You just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time." Andrew nodded, his chest tight. "I should have listened to my gut. I could have seen it all. The inconsistencies, the way she manipulated everyone around her." Margaret squeezed his arm reassuringly. "It's easy to say that now, but you can't beat yourself up for it. What matters is that you're here now, and you've learned something invaluable. Love isn't just about trust. It's about knowing who the person is, trusting them, not just with your heart, but with your life." Andrew let out a long breath, as if releasing the weight of his regret. "I'm just so angry. Not at you, but at her. At myself. For believing in her for so long." "I know, darling," Margaret whispered. "I'm angry, too. But we'll get through this. We always do." The reception, which had started as an extravagant affair, had quickly turned into something more genuine and raw. The guests, after witnessing the scandalous arrest, had slowly trickled out, their disbelief giving way to a more solemn kind of celebration. Those who remained, Andrew's close friends and family, found solace in each other's company, but there was an underlying sense of relief. The facade had fallen. The truth was out. As Andrew and Margaret made their way toward the empty ballroom, where the remnants of the wedding decorations lay scattered, Andrew stopped and turned to face his mother. "I don't even know how to process all of this, Mom. The woman I loved is gone, and I'm left wondering what I've been doing for the last year of my life." Margaret smiled softly, her eyes filled with a deep, quiet wisdom. "You've been living, sweetheart. And now it's time to move on. It's okay to grieve, but you don't need to let this define you. You're stronger than this. You always have been." Andrew's eyes filled with tears, though he quickly wiped them away. "I feel so lost, Mom. I thought she was the one. But now, everything feels like a lie. She wasn't the one, Andrew. The one for you is someone who will love you for who you are. Someone who will never deceive you, someone who will stand beside you when things get tough. That person is out there, and when the time is right, you'll find her. But you need to heal first. You need to take care of yourself." Andrew nodded, the weight of his mother's words sinking in. He realized, for the first time, that he didn't need Sarah to complete him. What he needed was time. Time to heal, to rebuild his trust, and most importantly, to rediscover himself outside of the illusion of love he had been trapped in. Later that evening, Margaret and Andrew found themselves sitting at the dessert table, the remnants of the wedding cake now a forgotten symbol of what could have been. But instead of feeling defeated, they found a moment of peace amidst the chaos. Andrew raised his glass of champagne, the clink of glasses cutting through the low hum of conversations around them. "To new beginnings," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. Margaret smiled warmly, raising her own glass. "To new beginnings," she repeated, the sense of pride in her voice undeniable. The night wore on, and the guests who remained, many of them relatives and close friends who had watched Andrew grow up, offered their support and comfort. There were no more questions about the wedding that could have been. There was no more pretending. It was a night of raw honesty, and in that moment, Margaret realized that sometimes the most painful moments bring about the most profound clarity. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. News of the scandal spread quickly, with the video of Sarah's arrest going viral. Hashtags like #weddingcrash and #conartistbride made their rounds across social media, but for Andrew, the attention was the least of his concerns. He spent the next few weeks in a haze of reflection, sorting through his emotions and slowly finding his way back to the life he once knew before Sarah entered it. Margaret, always by his side, helped him navigate the complicated emotions that followed the betrayal. She had done everything in her power to protect him, even if it meant breaking his heart in the process. But Andrew understood now. He understood why she had done it. She had acted out of love. And that was something he would never take for granted again. The final chapter of the wedding debacle came weeks later when Andrew and Margaret found themselves at a quiet cafe, sharing a moment of peace and reflection. As they sipped their coffee, Andrew turned to his mother, a soft smile playing at the corners of his lips. "I think I'm ready to move on," he said, his voice calm but determined. "I'm not saying I've got it all figured out, but I know I'm not going to let this break me. I've learned too much about myself, about love, and about the people I can trust." Margaret reached over and squeezed his hand. "I'm proud of you, Andrew. More than you'll ever know." And with that, the healing began. Sometimes, the best weddings are the ones that never happen. Sometimes, the most painful moments of our lives lead to the greatest growth. And sometimes, it's not about finding love, it's about rediscovering ourselves and the ones who truly love us. As the months passed, Andrew found his way back to who he was before Sarah. He rediscovered his passion for life, his friends, and most importantly, his mother, who had been his constant in the storm. And though he wasn't ready to love again, he knew that one day, he would find someone who would see him for who he truly was, not for the man he had been tricked into becoming. But for now, Andrew was content. He had been given the gift of clarity, and that was worth more than any wedding or romantic relationship could ever offer. Sometimes the best weddings are the ones that never happen. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.